There is someone in your life you never said the real thing to. Not because you didn't feel it, because somewhere along the way, you learned that people like you don't get to feel things out loud. So you showed up, you protected, you bled for them, and when it was finally over, you walked away. Not because you didn't care, because caring was the one thing you never learned how to survive. Toji Fushiguro had no cursed energy, no clan, no name worth keeping. He took everything the world said he was. Worthless, disposable, cursed with an empty body in a world that measured men by what burned inside them, and sharpened it into something nobody could touch. The most dangerous human alive, built entirely from what was taken from him. He died 3 feet away from his son. No words, no moment, nothing. Not because he didn't recognize Megumi, he did. And that's exactly why he couldn't speak. There's a pattern in people like Toji, a specific way the mind learns to survive when love was never safe to show. Psychologists have studied it, named it, written papers on it that nobody outside clinical circles ever reads. But it explains everything. Why Toji left, why he never came back, why he died the way he did. And once you see it, you'll recognize it in someone you know. Maybe yourself. Before Toji Fushiguro ever picked up a weapon, his psychology had already been decided for him. Not by choice, not by circumstance, by architecture, the architecture of the family he was born into, and the value system that family worshipped. He was born into the Zenin clan, one of the 3 most powerful sorcerer families in Japan. And in that world, power had exactly one definition: cursed energy. Not intelligence, not loyalty, not courage, not love. Cursed energy. How much burned inside you, how brightly it lit up on a technique. That was the measure of a human being in the Zenin household. That was the operating system the entire clan ran on. Strength meant cursed energy. Worth meant strength. Cursed energy meant you were human, and Toji had none. Not a little, not a trace. None. Think about what that means for a child growing up inside that system. It doesn't mean being the weakest in the room. It means being unclassifiable. Existing in a category the system has no language for, because the system was built on the assumption that everyone falls somewhere on the scale. Toji didn't fall anywhere. He fell outside it entirely. And when a child falls outside the system, especially a system built by the people responsible for their survival, the child doesn't conclude that the system is wrong. The child concludes that they are wrong. So they threw him into a disciplinary pit filled with grade 2 cursed spirits. As a child, not as training, not as challenge, as punishment. Punishment for existing in a way that embarrassed them. That's where the scar on his face came from. Not a battle, not a war. His own family, his own blood decided that his body needed to carry the permanent, visible evidence of what he was. This is what psychologists call conditional self-worth. It is the deep-rooted belief, carved in before a person is old enough to question it, that your value as a human being is not inherent. It is not something you were born with. It is not something you simply are. It is something you must earn, perform, prove, constantly. The moment you stop proving it, the worth disappears. Because it was never really there. It was always just a performance someone else was watching. When a child is raised inside this system from birth, when it is not a belief they develop but an atmosphere they breathe, something fundamental breaks in the architecture of their identity. They don't just feel worthless in moments of failure. They restructure their entire sense of self around the ongoing act of proving they deserve to exist. Worth stops being a state. It becomes a task. They stop asking who they are. They only ever ask what they can do. And here is what makes this psychologically devastating. The task can never be completed. Not because the person isn't performing. Toji performed at levels no one in the sorcerer world had ever seen. He performed beyond what should have been humanly possible. But conditional self-worth isn't a finish line. It's a treadmill. The moment you reach the standard moves. Because the people who set the standard never intended for you to reach it. The standard existed to keep you running, to keep you useful, controllable, and small. Toji didn't build himself into the strongest human alive because he loved fighting. He built himself because the alternative, sitting still, being seen, being evaluated without a performance to hide behind, meant risking the confirmation that the Zenin clan was right about him all along. Every contract he took, every sorcerer he killed, every impossible thing his body achieved, was the same answer to the same question he had been asked since childhood. Are you worth anything? He spent his entire life answering, contract after contract, kill after kill. moving through the world like a man trying to outrun a verdict that had already been written. And the answer was never enough. Because the people who asked the question were never going to accept any answer he gave. That was always the point. The question wasn't a test. It was a cage. That is not resilience. That is not strength. That is a wound-wearing armor, and the armor gets heavier every year. And eventually, if you wear it long enough, you forget there was ever anything underneath it. Here is what most people get wrong about Toji Fushiguro. They call him cold, detached, a mercenary, a man without attachment or purpose beyond the next contract and the next gambling table. They read his surface, the performance, and conclude that the performance is all there is, that underneath the Sorcerer Killer is nothing but mechanics. But that reading misses the psychological mechanism entirely. And once you understand the mechanism, you realize the surface isn't emptiness, it's protection. When someone is raised to believe they are fundamentally defective, when the message from early childhood is, "You are not enough as you are," they do not simply try to prove otherwise and move on. The wound doesn't work like that. The wound goes deeper than any single achievement can reach. What they do instead is construct an entirely external identity to replace the internal one they were never allowed to develop. They find one domain, one arena, where they can be undeniably, irrefutably real, where performance and worth align so completely that the question of who they are underneath the performance never has to be asked. And they pour everything into it, not because they love it, not because it fulfills them, but because it is the only mirror that shows them something other than what their family showed them. For Toji, that arena was the body. His heavenly restriction had removed every trace of cursed energy, the one currency of worth in the entire sorcerer world, the one thing that would have made him legible to the Zenin clan, gone completely from birth. But in exchange, and this is the part that makes Toji's story genuinely extraordinary, that same restriction gave him something the Zenin clan could never manufacture, never buy, and never grant to anyone regardless of bloodline. The most precisely engineered human body ever recorded in the history of Jujutsu. His physical capabilities weren't just elite. They were on a different plane of existence entirely. He could read the trajectory of a technique mid-combat, processing variables at a speed that trained sorcerers couldn't replicate standing still with time to prepare. He moved at velocities that rendered cursed techniques functionally irrelevant, because by the time the technique activated, he was already somewhere else. He turned his body into a weapon so refined, so complete, so devastatingly precise that the absence of cursed energy stopped being a deficit and became irrelevant. He didn't need what they had. He built something they couldn't comprehend. He became the Sorcerer Killer, a man who hunted and eliminated the very people his clan worshipped. A man who made the currency of the sorcerer world look like a toy by defeating its holders with nothing but flesh and precision. On the surface, that reads like revenge, like a man systematically dismantling the system that rejected him. But look closer. He didn't destroy the Zenin clan. He didn't burn it down. He didn't systematically eliminate every member of the family that threw him in a pit as a child. He took contracts, he got paid, he moved on to the next one, because it was never about revenge. Revenge requires a destination. Revenge has an endpoint, a moment when the score is settled and you can finally stop. Toji was never moving towards something. He was moving away from something, away from the silence, away from the stillness, away from the moment when the contracts stop, and there's nothing left to perform and the question resurfaces. Who are you when you're not proving something? He gambled compulsively. His associate Shu Kong noted plainly that Toji was not cut out for easy money. He couldn't accumulate, couldn't hold still long enough to build anything stable. Because an externalized identity is a machine that only runs when it's running. The moment it stops, the moment the fight ends and the contract is paid and the adrenaline fades, the person inside has to ask who they are without it. And Toji didn't have an answer to that question. He had never been allowed to develop one. So he kept fighting, kept moving, kept proving, to no one in particular and everyone at once, kept feeding the machine. Because the alternative wasn't peace. It was confronting the verdict that had been written about him before he could walk. But silence doesn't ask permission to break. There's a reason Toji named his son a word that means blessings. There's a reason that same man walked away from that same son days later. There's a reason that years after that, the strongest human being who ever lived stood 3 feet from his own child and said nothing at all. That's not where this story ends. That's where it actually starts making sense. Part 2 picks up everything that armor was hiding. The one person who got through it, what happened the day he lost her, and the exact moment all of it finally gave out. Subscribe if you want to be there when it does. This next one's heavier.